Did you have a good break? We originally planned to finish the conference at 5 p.m., but I have to confess that our staff's a little bit exhausted. So I want to inform you that the last session will be proceeded for about 1.5 hours, and I ask for your understanding. Last but not least, we would like to begin our final session. So let us move our focus on new area of public diplomacy in a post-pandemic world. For your reference, leading scholars from Korea and Europe will join this session. And before we start, I would like to introduce our moderator, Young-gul Choi, who is professor of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. And please be informed, he recently founded a center on media diplomacy. Please welcome Professor Choi with a big applause.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this wonderful seminar. The session title is New Area of Public Diplomacy in Post-Pandemic World. Let me first check the network. Can you clearly hear me now? Okay, great. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Young-gul Choi from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Media and Communication Department. It's a great honor to be here. And now, before the presentation begins, allow me to introduce the presenters. We have two wonderful presenters and two discussants. Our first presenter is Professor James Payment from Lund University Department of Strategic Communication in Sweden. I'm very pleased to find that Professor Payment spent some time at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my master and PhD degree. So I want to offer my special welcome, Professor James Payment. And our next presenter is a visiting professor, G.S. Sun from Ewha Women's University, International Studies. As we all know very well, she is a renowned journalist and scholar in the area of international relations. And now we have two great discussants, Professor Oliver Zeller from Stuttgart Media University, Germany, and research professor Yoon-hee Kim from Sookmyung University, Institute of Global Government. Please welcome our presenters and discussants. Okay, let's just start the session. In order to manage our time schedule, the session will be held for 90 minutes. Each presenter will have 25 minutes. Following the two presentations, Professor Zeller and Professor Kim will discuss about their presentations for 10 minutes. Each discussant can have 10 minutes, so after that, each presenter will be allowed to have 5 minutes to share their further thoughts based on their comments. Okay, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first presenter, Professor James Payment. Professor, the Zoom is now yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'll now share my screen. Is this working okay? Let's see. Is this sharing okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Great, perfect, thank you. So what I would like to talk about today for my 25 minutes is public diplomacy in relation to foreign interference. And I think part of the question here is that in a lot of theories of public diplomacy, we tend to imagine in our minds that there are just two countries participating. There's the country that does public diplomacy, and then there's the host country that the public diplomacy is done in. So it's like a two-country model. of how public diplomacy works. But of course, in reality, we know that there are many disruptive elements between you and the audience that you're trying to reach and those relationships that you're trying to shape. And for the last 5 years now, I've spent most of my time working on these questions of the impact of foreign interference and of how you build communications capabilities in order to ensure that your public diplomacy and your messages aren't disrupted by someone else's behavior, that the foreign interference isn't able to have the effects that those who are trying to disrupt your communications want to have. And I think we've seen particularly during this year with the coronavirus, just how disruptive and how dangerous some of some of the problems in the information environment can actually be. So it's really in that context that I'm speaking today. And I'm going to really talk about 3 areas in some detail. The first is how you build an awareness of a situation, how you understand how disruption takes place, and how you track it and how you monitor for disruption. The second area is how you then use that information for data-driven decision making. And then the third section is about how you then develop a kind of diplomatic or public diplomacy approach to communication in this context. And I'll end by spending some time talking about the skills that are necessary for a public diplomat today. So essentially, I'll end with a job specification. So if that sounds okay to you and interesting enough for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll continue. So the work that I've been doing, here's some examples of some publications that have come out in the last few years. As you'll notice, most of these are not academic books, but they're actually directly supporting practitioners. And that's really been the focus of my work for the last, certainly since 2016. It's been developing really hands-on, very practical operational guides for foreign ministries, for the equivalent of presidents and prime ministers' offices, but also with centers of excellence who work in this area. And developing toolkits, processes, models, all of the basic kind of tools that practitioners would use while they're dealing with foreign interference. And here's some of the organizations that my various teams, either at Lund University or at Carnegie, have been working with, where we've done training or worked on projects together with them. So I promised that I would begin by talking about situational awareness. Now, this is the original model that we came up with when we started working with the Swedish government on protecting the 2018 election. So back in 2017, together with some colleagues, we came up with a model that tried to explain in one picture how foreign interference takes place. Now, I can appreciate that this is a very complicated picture. It looks quite nice, but it's quite difficult to understand. So in developing it into like some hands-on guidance, we eventually came up with this. And this is part of a handbook that we developed for public sector communications professionals in Sweden, where basically every communications professional working in local government, in cities, anywhere in the public sector, was given access to a handbook that guided them through how to understand foreign interference. And so the model, we managed to boil it down into a much simpler stage. I will go back to the more complicated picture just to talk you through that as well. But we developed this model to help practitioners make sense of the information environment. And so starting from left to right, if you imagine that something happens somewhere, there's an event It could be an announcement of a scientific breakthrough, perhaps the vaccine announcement. It could be a terrorist event somewhere, an explosion, but something is happening somewhere. And then you have experts and officials and sources, scientists, eyewitnesses. You'll have people who come out who are sources of what happened and who explain what happens to you. They say, yes, indeed, there has been an explosion. And maybe that would come from the police, or maybe the ambulance people would say 5 people were injured, or maybe a scientist would say, yes, we have, in fact, this discovery has been made and we can confirm that the information is valid. And then you have media and culture sources mediating that information. So they'll report on it, they'll collect together eyewitnesses, representatives, officials, build their own version of the story, and then communicate that through newspapers, television, the internet, etc. And this information then filters through your social context. So the public sphere, which could be you speaking to your friends. Did you hear that this has happened? Or it could be your friends on the internet where you're having a similar debate with people who you've never met in person. And eventually all of this filters through to you and you make up your own decision about what you think is happening. The problem is that there are vulnerabilities built into each of these stages. So the experts and the officials who explain a situation, well, they can be bought, they can be fabricated, they can be, if you manage to bring in an expert who isn't actually an expert, who explains the science behind something, that can lead to false stories getting into the press. So we had examples of a news site traveling to Sweden, going to an area where there had been bad press about the about violence in that area, and trying to pay young people to start trouble. So what you then have is sources, eyewitnesses, etc., who have actually been paid to create the story. And then you can have your own media and culture outlets. So you can develop your own news platforms that become sources of stories, but in fact, they're designed to support an organization's objectives. So they aren't following the same ethics of news as one might expect, which means that there's an overall vulnerability in how media collects stories, how it proves that something's happened, and how issues are represented. There can also be a vulnerability in public opinion formation. So, as I mentioned, the media sources can be unreliable, but then you can also start to have these discussions in the public sphere where you think you're talking to a community who has strong views, but actually the community is being manipulated. So we've all heard about bots and influence that's paid for. You can buy likes, you can buy boosts, you can buy followers, and you can essentially boost a discussion or one side of a discussion to make it seem like lots of people interpret something in a certain way. And this is something that's very much a vulnerability that the disruptive elements in the information environment have learned to make use of. And then lastly, in ourselves, we also have these cognitive vulnerabilities built in, things like wanting to believe things that confirm our own biases. These kind of typical vulnerabilities that we have, we think that because we know the people who say something, the information's more reliable, for example. So these 3 vulnerabilities, if I go back to the more complex image, what it gives you the ability to do is map out where the influence takes place. So for example, if we start now on the right-hand side, so the event that happened, or the evidence that's appearing, actually you can target this area by, for example, forging a document or leaking information or creating these research centers that are actually your own creations, that are publishing research, like the tobacco industry did in the 1950s and 60s, creating this research that isn't genuine research. So that's one area where you can affect this chain and start to affect the information that's reaching people. And that's fine, because if you have experts who can then say, no, that's not a genuine document, and you have media that can then say, here's the story. The story is that someone tried to forge this information, or the story is that this research agency isn't real. Then the system rebalances, it self-corrects, and we don't really have too much of a problem. The problem comes if you can, as someone who's disruptive, if you can start hitting two or more of these areas, it then becomes much harder for the system to find its equilibrium again. For example, if we do have a forgery of a document, but then we also own the media platform, which means that we can then bring in our own experts to comment on the forgery, well, suddenly we have 3 stages of this chain under our control. And it becomes much more difficult then for the public sphere and for you to make an informed decision about what's happening. So the purpose of this approach was really to find a way to try and map where the disruptive techniques can affect our decision-making and this overall chain of how information circulates, and to map it out so that you can actually, if you want to, you can do a process study of how some disinformation or a hybrid attack or some kind of interference was structured. And it can help you make sense and better understand where the remedies can then take place. What's the weakness in our system that we need to correct? So it could be, for example, making our experts more available to the press. It could be training journalists and warning them about some of the issues that are happening, for example. The second area I wanted to talk about is data-driven decision-making. In this piece of work, which is called the Resist Counter Disinformation Toolkit, a large portion of the toolkit focuses on how you make decisions in complex multi-stakeholder situations. So this toolkit was written shortly after the Salisbury poisoning, where a lot of the learning in the UK government had come from how you bring together different stakeholders to solve a very complex problem that affects multiple areas of vulnerability at the same time. So for example, there were national security aspects of this. There was a public health aspect of it, but there was also reputational staff safety issues, you know, an incredibly complex issue where the decision-making was happening with multiple stakeholders around the table. So it would be everyone from local government to public health to then your security policy people and the intelligence people and politicians who then have to go make statements. So how do you bring these people around the table and make informed communications decisions that reflect risk and the complexity of the situation? And that was really the challenge in creating this model. And so what we ended up developing, my team at Lund University, was a series of structured analysis stages where the information from media monitoring is basically put into some structured analysis tools, and you use this to then support decisions. So for example, working through which areas of your business areas a problem affects. Maybe it's a reputational issue, maybe it affects your vulnerable audiences, maybe it affects the climate of debate. Then working through the likelihood of this issue trending and becoming either something that is in a very limited corner of the internet where a few people are discussing this, but it's not really an important discussion, or where it's a headline story that affects your day-to-day work. And then working through these and some other kind of quite simple tables to eventually reach a decision of whether something is high priority. So basically it's headline news where we need to prepare for a crisis response. Medium, which is more about proactive communications, or low, which means more shaping the information environment over a longer period of time. Developing these kinds of decision-making models is really important to public diplomacy, because often communication decisions are not very transparent. The director of communications will say, we're going to do this because I'm very experienced and I know what we should do. So we needed ways to really unpack the decision-making process so that others who don't understand communications can participate in those same decisions. And the third area that I wanted to talk about is multi-stakeholder or kind of diplomatic approaches to communication. And this comes from some work that I've been doing in the last year on the European Democracy Action Plan, which has been more of a policy-oriented piece of work, less operational. And what we found in developing this approach is that actually there are different kinds of problems, and these different problems need to be unpacked at first at the policy level in order for us to then understand how to respond to them. So for example, currently in EU policy, the only issue in terms of foreign interference and in the information sphere is disinformation. It's called disinformation policy. But for me, disinformation is a very specific thing. It's false information where there's an intent to mislead. And there are other terms that are also useful. So for example, misinformation, which is unintentionally spreading false information. So I believe something and I spread it, but it turns out to be wrong. Oh, I made a mistake. Disinformation, I'm spreading it because I want to deceive people. But also these slightly more concerning terms, these slightly more concerning practices, influence operations. So coordinated activities where there's an intent to mislead, but actually through almost a campaign approach where there are several different activities happening at once in order to achieve an effect. And then foreign interference, where a state actor is behind those activities and is putting significant resources into undermining national security. And the reason these four terms are necessary is because the response, the communicative response, is actually quite different. You know, someone's spreading misinformation, so they believe something, but what they believe turns out to be wrong. That's really a question of public education. It's really a question of access to sources, of how a person builds their understanding of an issue. So the remedies, the countermeasures and the communications need to emphasize these democratic aspects. How do we better inform people so that they don't spread incorrect information? How do we help people find the correct information? Whereas people who spread disinformation, the remedy is partly correcting what's out there, but also engaging with the people who are spreading disinformation and trying to disincentivize that. So maybe people spread disinformation because there's money to be made from it. If you create a website, you put up some stories that have false information, but you know there's a market for that information, so lots of people will click. You make a fraction of a penny on every click, and maybe you can make a few $1,000s by spreading this disinformation. Well, if we can disincentivize those activities, either through education, by making it harder to build these websites that enable clicks, or by whatever measures, but still it's essentially a question of how we educate people and how we limit the spread of false information without necessarily banning it, because often it's not illegal to lie in many countries. You're allowed to do it. It's just unethical. But then influence operations, it's a different matter. Here we're talking about an actor who has tremendous capabilities and is coordinating probably with dozens, maybe hundreds of people at the same time to conduct a whole operation. And so here it's really about developing countermeasures that change the way the actor calculates their activities. So it's actually to disincentivize what they're doing. If they know they'll be punished, for example, fined or deplatformed for doing this kind of work, then that can be a way of affecting that debate. And lastly, foreign interference, you have things like sanctions, you have travel bans, expulsions, these kinds of tools. So it really escalates in terms of the methods that you can use to countermeasure. And many of these come from the diplomatic toolkit. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the public diplomacy skills. Really, I think the modern public diplomat needs to understand how to assess the information environment, how to conduct situational awareness, and how to understand threat assessments and develop risk assessments. They need to understand what motivates these key audiences and what drives them. They need to understand the techniques of influence and their ethics, not just all of the typical techniques that we usually talk about, you know, putting out press releases, doing exchanges, international broadcasting, but also some of the darker techniques, the influence techniques that go against ethical norms, and understand how they work together, perhaps with legitimate techniques to create an impact. They need to understand how to use data, particularly data from media monitoring, understandings of how influencers shape the information environment, in order to support decisions and to explain the information environment to people who don't understand communications. And they need to be able to make risk assessments in order to make decision-making about communications transparent. They need to understand how influencers and multipliers shape an issue, and understand that some influence techniques work well individually, others need to be used in combination, and through them, you can correct an incorrect image, you can communicate an accurate image, you can counteract negative influence and shape the information space. There are many different goals that you can achieve if you understand how to combine these different communication techniques. There's also a need to communicate risk and ambiguity. Sometimes it isn't clear exactly what's happening. Sometimes the assessments will be in terms of probability and not 100% certainty. The multi-stakeholder side of it is becoming increasingly important, and also that ability to coordinate and take a balance between soft measures, so communications, incentives, but also hard measures, disincentives, sanctions, deplatforming, these harder steps, leading actually into a sense of deterrence. In some aspects of public diplomacy, a deterrence aspect, don't do this against us because there will be consequences, is also part of how you minimize disruptive activities. So in conclusion, our dear colleague, Nick Cull, has argued that there's a securitization of reputation and the national image going on in public diplomacy at the moment. I think it's much more than that. I think reputation is the tip of the iceberg. This is about how we understand the very basics of public diplomacy, not as something between two countries, the country that does public diplomacy and the country that receives it, but as a much more complex communication environment in which disruption is just part of the environment. Developing structured analysis tools, structured processes is essential to moving beyond public diplomacy as we know it. And communication is the core of public diplomacy, but there are lots of other aspects that I've been touching on now, including things like deterrence. And we shouldn't forget that underpinning this new public diplomacy is still the diplomatic approach, which means building partnerships, finding overlaps between interests and solving complex multi-stakeholder problems together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pement. That was a really interesting and informative presentation. Especially, I cannot more than agree with your idea that structured analysis is much needed nowadays. Thank you again. Okay, then let's have our second presenter, Professor Ji-sun, please.
Thank you. My presentation is going to be a lot more, I think we are in a stage where the sun is coming down better in a moment. This is what happens when you're doing virtual. You have to depend on elements like nature and the sun bending. Anyway, my talk is quite different. I approach it from a different perspective. My presentation comes out of a question and curiosity that I had when talking about new issues that might come forth in the area of public diplomacy in the post-pandemic world. We have talked, and many of our previous presenters have talked about media, social media, things that have happened. I would actually like to put the media and the positioning and the importance of media in the context of democracy, because one of the things that we have observed during the pandemic is an acceleration of a trend that we actually have seen before media in terms of the difficulties and the challenges to democracy around the world, and the forces that have come into play during the pandemic have influenced and maybe have accelerated some aspects of that trend. And so as we come out of it, talking about the role of the media, which is actually, when you think about democracy, the freedom of speech is a central pillar of democracy. Trying to understand how that has impacted media, and how the whole threat to democracy has impacted how the media will look like in the future, is something that is interesting to observe. Since we're still within the grips of the pandemic, it is something like trying to read the tea leaves. But I think it is an important exercise that we try to do at this moment, so that we are able to think about the positioning of the media in the framework of democracy in the world that we are seeking to build or rebuild after the pandemic. So it's more of a talk aimed at starting a dialogue. So if we can think of it that way. As I talked about before, even before the pandemic, there has been concern about the democracy in crisis, the decline of democracy. Is democracy dead? Those are in the titles of many well-known and best-selling books prior to COVID-19. And this trend in the global arena rose with the decline of multilateralism. When the United States, with Trump, America First, when they pulled back from the multilateral institutions, there was a lot of concern about whether the decline of multilateralism would mean that there would be a rise of nationalism, where every country would be fending for itself, and that the global concerns that need global cooperation, like climate change, like hunger, those kind of issues would not be dealt with. and would suffer a decline in development. So there was a concern even before COVID-19 about where the global society was heading. And then, of course, from the beginning of this year, COVID-19 hit, and it hit, this is one of the rare instances where almost every country in the world has gone through and experienced almost the same difficulties. So the experience of one country is not that different from, or the difficulties of one country is not that different from the difficulties of another. And just to talk about, what one country has gone through, in terms of the leadership and the governing of a country during COVID-19, a former Prime Minister of Norway, Prime Minister Bondevik, we were talking about his difficulties and his experiences in terms of what Norway went through, and it's fairly similar for every country. It was really they were trying to juggle a number of balls. One, to preparing healthcare, empowering healthcare to meet the challenges of this COVID-19, while at the same time dealing with the difficult business difficulties. Businesses were shutting down, restaurants were going out of business, travel agencies were exploding. So the difficulties, the jobs that were being lost, and to help the people to survive the crisis was a commonplace challenge for most governments around the world. And so the governments in this kind of situation felt the need to balance this danger by putting forth control, need for effective control of the situation, of information, of the systems and the institutions that were in their country, at the same time allowing for a certain amount of democratic freedoms. Now, I just saw a new study by the Freedom House report that during this kind of crisis situation, what has happened is that many governments, and you think of it as sort of a natural development, many governments felt the desire, well, I shouldn't say desire, fell under the temptation of exercising more control, stricter control on their countries in order to go through and survive this COVID-19 crisis. And the Freedom House report that has just come out, titled Democracy Under Lockdown, and I urge you to read it, it's a fascinating report, has shown that global democracy has grown weaker during the pandemic. If you look at the, sorry, this is me. If you look at, my fault, if you look at the, what is happening during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, this slide shows that is part of the Freedom House report that is showing that around the world, it's about 190 some countries that they've surveyed. 80 countries have actually seen their democratic institutions grow weaker. 111 countries have really pretty much sustained their democratic institutions, and only one country has seen their democratic institution become stronger. So you see that, the weaker in the red, about the same in the white, and you really don't see I don't see any, well, it's very, very small, blue spot on this global map, which shows that this is what has many governments have faced as they were trying to survive and come out of this COVID-19 situation intact. Now, when you think about democratic institutions, and the Freedom House report looked at the 5 pillars of democracy. The first one was transparency in terms of the democratic institutions, information transparency, and they found that 62% of surveyed respondents said that their the information really declined. There was the increase of distrust of pandemic-related information supplied by their governments. The second pillar, which actually we're going to focus on more, is that the freedom of free media and expression. 91 countries said that they faced more or increased restrictions on the news media as a result of the outbreak. And of course, the credible elections, the free and fair election process that is also central to democracies has suffered the increase of police violence, new restrictions on ethical minorities, which is a factor in terms of the inclusiveness of democracy. So while all of these pillars have seen weakening during the pandemic, the ones that we would like to really focus on in terms of the relevance to public diplomacy is what has happened in terms of media. The former Prime Minister of Norway, Bondevik, talked about the fact that because many governments felt the temptation to control, not only the temptation, but the need to control media and information as the country tried to survive and help its people, they did apply more stricter controls on media, that there was a need, and people felt that that the media needed to cooperate with the government in a greater fashion than before. So there have been many ways that governments have tried to conduct this. The more optimal methods have been, you've seen even in Korea, increasingly they have done direct information to the people. This is what you see in terms of, if you look at Korea, every day since the COVID-19 epidemic, I think since February, there have been daily briefings that have been aired live. There are no media in terms of interpretations for that briefing. So it is the information direct from the health authorities to the people. So there is a direct link, and therefore that allows for a certain amount of information that goes directly from the authorities to the people. So that's one way in terms of trying to improve the information that is relayed on to the people. But of course, that's not the only kind of information. There's a lot of other news stories that go surrounding the pandemic. And so this kind of information, news source, is one of the ways that the government has felt, they needed to address. In the process of this, and the Prime Minister Bondevik says that while in democratic institutions and democratic leaders have been trying to be very fair and open about it, the more weaker democracies or the more authoritarian governments have actually used this period to crack down and to really suppress media in ways that have gone beyond the need for accurate information. And so actually, I like to use this example as much as possible because Maria is a really good friend of mine. Maria Ressa we work together at CNN, but her example is one in which Rappler is an online news media that she set up with her friends in the Philippines in the early part of the 200. I think it was 2012, something along those ways. But it's a really popular news media that has been very innovative in terms of how it relays information to the people, and it actually has been very popular among the younger generation. And so it has, Maria is a CNN person, so she's obviously a little bit more critical of governments than other media heads in the Philippines. But she has been sort of made the target of the Duterte government in the Philippines. She faces a libel suit. She was found guilty, and there is a very good chance that she will do prison time in the Philippines. But the other aspect of this that is very important to note is that even during the pandemic, you see her being one of the number of persons of the year that made the cover. Other media organizations took it upon themselves to really tell her story. And so she has been able to, that her story has not been left in the dark. But she is a minority. Many other media journalists who have tried to voice concern or opposition to authoritarian governments in this COVID crisis have been silenced in ways that we have no idea. And so, the Washington Post, which has the slogan "Democracy dies in darkness," we have been relatively dark to the media and the freedom violations that have been going on around the world, because every country in the world has faced their own COVID crisis, and so it has just not been. It has been very difficult for us to really focus on the more aspects of democracy, of press freedom, that would have maybe otherwise gotten greater attention. So this is one of the things that I like to say. Maria's doing very well, if anyone's interested. So the Freedom House report also agrees that media restriction has been one of the key government abuses during the pandemic. And the relationship between the government and the free press really has been put under a test. And we're still in that process of that relationship between the government and free press. We have seen, as I said, many authoritarian governments, weak democracies place stricter controls on the media, have, sometimes call it censorship, but let's say it's control, a stricter control over the media. And so, the government has, and the more democratic institutions have really gone on to utilize different methods, such as direct channels of communications, press briefings, which is, as you see, in not only in Korea, but when you see, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Canada, whenever the important COVID-related developments happen, it is usually the leadership that come out directly to the people, and they actually utilize the media to present their case, to really be, to put forth the information, and to be honest with it, to be open with it, which is sort of not what you saw in the United States, but we'll get to that a little later. So that has been one of the ways that the more open and democratic societies have tried to deal with the challenges of working with the media during this very difficult time. Now, the Freedom House also talks about the fact that, okay, we're still not completely in a post-pandemic world, but so far on the lessons and what developments that we have seen so far, what are the recommendations and what can we possibly learn from this kind of development? And the recommendation that they have put forth is that that you have to, in order to be able to preserve democracy, ensure that a free and independent media can thrive and people can have access to fact-based information. The Prime Minister Bondoff also talked about the fact that, you may think that in the short term, stricter controls on the media may help you in terms of keeping your people safe or getting them through difficulties of a pandemic. But you have to make sure that it is a short-term solution, that you are looking at a more long-term effect of this kind of movement on your democracy. And these kind of media issues, the loss of trust, which have been prevalent even before the pandemic. I mean, a lot of other presenters have talked about it, so I won't really dwell on this. But the fake news, which is news that makes it look like real news, but is totally a lie. The misinformation, and then we have these things called post-truths or alternative facts. I want to remind you that alternative facts was first brought up in 2017 in the United States, the pillar of democracy, where the Kellaway Conway, who was the advisor to then just newly inaugurated President Trump, was talking about the White House press secretary. And if you remember, it was him talking about that the people that attended the inauguration, Trump's inauguration, was bigger than that of Obama, which was not true. And when she was pressed about it, she asked that those were not lies, but alternative facts. So it became sort of what for a while in my house was considered, not a lie, but an alternative fact. Anyway, so, and there are many studies being done, and probably will need to be done a lot more after the pandemic in terms of really what kind of effect the media had during the pandemic. If you see this one, this is the Washington Post graph of how Fox News, which is a very pro-Trump news organization, in terms of how they treated and how seriously they took the pandemic. And it's sort of, even if you look at the March 15th, which was obviously at a time in the United States when the pandemic when the cases were rising, and it was heading into this awful peak during the summer. Even at that time, the main Fox News organizations, Tucker Carlson and Hannity, didn't really take the Fox News seriously, which is really in parallel with how Trump dealt with the pandemic. And so it showed that a press that really did not take its cues from facts, but from the political leaders, would have had this kind of effect on how a country felt about the pandemic. And if they had taken a different tone, would the United States been in a different kind of situation than they are in now? So all of these kind of questions need to be asked. A lot of studies need to be done on the role of the media and as a part of the pandemic, but also the role of the media in terms of its role in democracy. Democracy is, the free and free press is considered a pillar of democracy, but in terms of free press that disseminates divisive narratives, is that also a pillar? But how does this all run into what kind of world that we want to build post-pandemic? We have to think about the fact that in democratic institutions, there is really no fallback to a free press. And that, the media, in terms of media controls, it is not a long-term solution. And that the responsibility of the media in terms of what effect it will actually have on democratic institutions, as well as the health of the country as a whole, is increasingly important. And so all these kind of studies, I think, need to be done aggressively with the pandemic, as the pandemic era closes, hopefully, praying, and so that we are able to deal with the post-pandemic world in a better way. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for keeping the time too. Listening to Professor Pament and Professor Sun, I think regardless of pandemic, the weakening democracy challenged by the vulnerability in communications and the decrease in the news trust and the suppression of media freedoms has been new normal in this society. So, but however, both presenters also provided the alternative ways to count these troubles, problems too. So now let's dive into the discussions about two presentations. Professor Oliver Zeller, please join us with your thoughts. Please.
Yes, hello. Good morning, and thank you very much. Good morning from Stuttgart here in Germany. And thank you, Professor Pament and Professor Son, for your presentations. Well, I only have 10 minutes, so let me try to summarize my thoughts. We had one plea for democracy and one plea for an enlarged concept of education, I would say. Sorry, my throat. So here I am again, and one plea for a broader concept of education, or even what we might call Bildung, that was given by Mr. Pament. So it's a very broad topic. I think it addresses the future of being able to pursue public diplomacy and how it will be possible. The dilemma, Mr. Pament, you mentioned very clearly, it's, well, the way that people use the media these days, social media platforms, online platforms, they are with us and they won't go away. And yet that is also fast becoming one of the major areas for the practice of public diplomacy. That is how we reach people, that is how we reach out to people, and that is where we place messages. Now, if you're on social media as a public diplomacy institution, you're in competition with everybody else. So with friends and relatives and regular folks tweeting and posting, etc. And of course, with other countries and media organizations that are also trying to reach people, and not always in a truthful manner. And that is the problem that you addressed. Now, how to tackle with these forms of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, alternative facts, and what you call it. I think that is at the heart of the debate. We still have to use that media sphere, and you have addressed, the structural transformation of the public sphere that is going on. It's, I think, a reset of our thinking about how we as people live together and think together, and how we perceive media messages and how we deal with them. Now, that brings me to my thoughts on public diplomacy. You mentioned also measures of deterrence to be taken by public diplomacy actors. For example, the European Union that you mentioned is obviously doing this. Well, would that mean, I would like to ask you later on, that even liberal democracies would now engage in a kind of Cold War setting again? So is that a call for a new kind of Cold War between various groups of countries or ideologies, ? And where would that leave Western values? I mean, that are based on truthfulness and not using, well, hopefully not using forces of deterrence, etc. So that is the larger question of where do Western countries, for example, set good examples in terms of free speech? And that brings me to my question of, well, how can we in this climate carry on doing public diplomacy in a truthful, democratic, liberal, value-based manner that is based on truth and trust? I know the stakes are pretty high, but this is what I'm asking myself. How will we as countries be able to look each other in the eye again after COVID-19? And not only as individuals, but really as countries as well. And what values are we trying, or will we have to start to promote or to promote again? And I think that is the larger issues. Also thinking about Mrs. Son's presentation and also to Mr. Pament's presentation, I think we need to design new narratives of what it means to be a good and respectable country, and a country that stands for certain values that are good for humanity. I mean, because as we all know, propaganda and fake news, etc., is bad and is taken away from people's flourishing lives. So how can countries really contribute to the idea of providing the measurements for a good or flourishing lives? I mean, that is an ethical question. And I think we need more ethics in public diplomacy, yes. And also, as Mr. Pament, you rightly pointed out, we need more education, but probably not only on the side of journalists, which is also, yes, right, and diplomats, absolutely right. But, and that is the larger issue, also on the sides of general populations. We need media training, we need media education, and that I feel should start right at the age of kindergarten or preschool. And that is, you know, a very broad issue that cannot be solved by public diplomacy alone. So these are a few thoughts that your presentations, which I found very interesting, sparked, and that we need to address. And I think this is a very good arena to start talking about these issues. We need to reset our thinking about our media systems and how we use the media. And I think that is the core argument of both your presentations. So I think I have, well, more about used my time, and well, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zeller. The Professor Zeller actually provided by actually very difficult questions actually to answer. You know, these are the fundamental questions actually we need to answer to tackle down the troubles actually weakening democracy. So I think I expect very thoughtful ideas about these questions from both presenters. Okay, then let's have the discussions from our second presenters, and after that, we're going to talk about the presenter thought about the discussions, the comments. Okay, Professor Kim, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation previously. I learned a lot through the presentation from Professor Pamet and Professor Son. And to be honest with you, like Professor Pamet, I attended your presentation when I was my first year PhD at Durham University in England. It was really like nice to meet you further, like although it is a visual conference. I would like to say that actually I'm not like a research into the field of media and media strategy communication or related field, but more close to government international relations. From the perspective of government and international, this field, media is very important. Through the presentation, through Professor Pamet and Professor Son, we can say that media and politics are really hard to split or detach from one another. So this is because, like Professor Son mentioned that, like fake news and misinformation and like post-truth and alternative or related news are like kind of contentious nowadays. But I think this is also a new type of 21st century. kind of propaganda, a new way of persuasion and propaganda, which like during the Cold War era, a lot of, especially like the US and the USSR, they use their way of communication to persuade to other side of people. So through like media is very crucial, but like Professor Sung mentioned that the media that disseminates these divisive narrative help or like trust democracy. This is very crucial to think or discuss on or research into, because we need to think that all democracy-based countries give the freedom, media freedom to their people, and their people could get a truth and the like actual fact news like evenly nowadays. That is also the question, because a majority of people nowadays, they do not trust their government news or the news media, their article contents. It's really hard to believe, because there's like kind of like always try to like intrude or like mediated news, and their reaction always involved. So I think this is also a new type of the government try to rule their country by using the media. So I want to ask, try to ask a question to Professor Pemit. Actually, you introduced a lot of the European perspective, like I would like to call it as Western perspective media, like kind of strategic communication with their people. But you set up the kind of decision-making like frame on how to make a good decision, like first off, starting from the news, like kind of exposing news and collecting data, and how their people could make their decision based on the like fact. But this kind of decision could be different, or could be comprehended differently based on each country's political system, because some countries already well-developed democracy, but the other countries like still ongoing and need a lot of kind of their homework to be on their certain stage. So what is this kind of good kind of structure to have the good making, the decision making based on like a kind of good media to other side of the world, which is not the European country? And I want to ask Professor Sung as well, like how can we kind of recognize and how can we get the truth of news from the news contents all over the world around us? How can we recognize it, and how can the government should establish some kind of criteria standard to avoid and like get rid of the kind of intervene like kind of sort of misinformation to their people? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your discussion. I think Professor Kim also agree with the ideas that provided by the presentation, that the media environment nowadays are also in danger, to meet the goals of the liberal democracy. So I guess we should talk hear from our presenters about the questions. So Professor Pemit, will you go first?
Professors Sung and Kim, these were really interesting, stimulating questions. So in terms of deterrence and kind of democratic ways of deterring, there are some really interesting soft measures that can be taken, particularly in conjunction with the big digital platforms. So one of them, for example, is like platforms promote content, and that's part of their function. They take content that they think people will find interesting and they lift it up into your feed. So one option for them is actually to demote content that contains falsehoods. If something is identified as being disinformation or misinformation, no one has the right to have everything they say promoted. So the platforms could develop algorithms that demote certain kinds of content and don't bring them to your attention within your feed. Another thing they can do is adapt the way their services work and the terms of service depending on the size of the audience. Some people use, let's say Facebook, for example, to stay in touch with friends and just share interesting stories. Other people use it essentially as publishers and broadcasters. They may have hundreds of thousands of followers. And there should, in my mind, be different terms of services that gives different responsibilities to you depending on how you use the platform. Another issue is the media manipulation industry. Now, I'm sure that the YouTube video of this conference has many, many followers, but if you wanted a boost, I think within about 15 minutes, I could get you thousands of likes, comments, views for a couple of $100 that would completely change the appearance of how many people have viewed this conference. And you know, this doesn't have to be legal. Like this industry, you know, we can do things to make it harder for this industry to manipulate the media environment and make it seem as though, make it easy to change the appearance of things within social media. And I think the important thing here is to bear in mind that if we can stay within fundamental freedoms, but find ways of altering how these processes work, then we're not restricting anything. We're not taking away any freedoms. We're not censoring. We're just changing how things are promoted and the access to audiences that certain types of information have, rather than banning them or censoring them. And that, I think, is a democratic way of at least in the next few years developing a response. I don't think I have enough time to go through all of the questions, so I'll also address Professor Kim's question about developing countries. And I think it's a very, you know, I completely agree. The model I showed you was designed for Sweden and for other Western liberal democracies. It doesn't really apply very well to developing countries. I think the question is, how do you take the basics, kind of the fundamentals of some of these models, and tailor them to each context? Because every country is different. Every political system is a little bit different. Some of the laws around what you can and can't say are different. But also government capabilities are different. The exposure of digital media is different. The way people use digital media is different. Even the internet is different in some developing countries, where it comes through phones with Facebook, and that's your internet, you know. So I think there are some building blocks within some of the examples I've given you that can be tailored to developing countries. The problem is, you know, energy and resources. Somebody needs to do this work. People need to be trained. Again, it comes down to education, but also at the level of governments and academics and experts. But I think the building blocks are there. We need to keep working on developing and tailoring them to suit the different markets. But it's a huge job, and I agree with you that much more attention needs to be given to some of these developing countries, because the problems there are much more, are incredibly significant, but don't get anything like the same amount of attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Payment. He suggested several actually ways to tackle the problems we have. He mentioned about some technical solutions using new media platforms and then alternative algorithms, something like that. And then he also mentioned about the, actually he emphasized, even though we are facing some challenges of liberal democracy, he actually seems like emphasized we need more democratic ways to solve the problems. And he also mentioned he agreed with the Professor Kim's idea that developing countries have asymmetrical powers in solving these problems. So actually, each country needs to tailor some models into their context. So those are very thoughtful answers to the questions. Okay, Professor, please share your ideas about their comments.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting comments. And actually, I really loved Professor Pumnen's presentation as well. I learned a lot. I especially liked your comment about how you could really change the algorithms and you know and have people. It seemingly like that that we'd have hundreds of more viewers than we did, and I have to admit the temptation was there, and so so there is that aspect of it. But I also think that you know there's a Chinese proverb that, or I don't know if it's Chinese, it may be Korean. It's 권선징악, which means that you know the good are awarded and the bad are punished. So in some ways, I think so I'm optimistic about democracy because of what is happening in terms of the overall. The studies and more and more, and we're still not at the end, so we'll have to see at the very end how it goes. But more and more it seems that the more democratic governments actually are faring better in the COVID, in the fight against COVID, in keeping their people safe, in getting their economy back on track faster. So at the end of the day, the openness and the truthfulness that governments and institutions have dealt with their people, and how the media has worked towards that end, and it has worked hand in hand with the media towards that end. It seems to be working better than most authoritarian governments that have tried to control the media and try to do it in that way. So at the end of the day, that may be one of the ways that that shows that you know a free press, a trusted press in a democratic institution is a good way to go, and maybe a good sign for even other developing countries as well. The other sign is obviously Trump lost, so that you know the fact that even though the media in the United States, in terms of you know the misinformation that started right at the top, really, and all the media you know workings that he had tried to do in terms of sidelining a great size of the media as fake news, and only dealing with the media that he likes, or you know creating ones, sidelining them as soon as they said anything that he didn't like. All that kind of activity, I mean, again, we don't know the very end, but it seems to be that it has really not led to him being reelected. So that, you know, it also shows that, you know, that there is a certain prevalence of people knowing basically, or not all, but a majority of the people knowing, you know, what to trust and who to trust. And hopefully that sends a good message to the media as well, so that there is a correlation between truth and trust and responsibility, so that people understand after the pandemic that, you know, fake or misinformation has consequences. And so we have to come up with either, whether it's algorithms or with education, a way to better deal with media and the information that we are being exposed to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have a question. Actually, this is not my question, because I think this is the Professor Jeller's question. Actually, I don't think both of the presenters didn't answer to the Jeller's question. I think Professor Jello believes that this society in general is not progressing anymore because I think he believes that the society, which is based on the fundamental values, including the trust and the cooperation, something like that, which are also fundamental beliefs of liberal democracy. These are not actually working nowadays. And then we have this kind of the vulnerabilities in communication and media systems, which are also structured based on the belief systems of trust and cooperation. So I think the Professor Jello asked you guys that are there any alternative values? Can we actually construct new belief systems which actually helps to develop alternative political system, something like that? So, Professor Jello, is that your question? If I'm wrong, just correct me.
No, you're furthering up on my question. Yeah, well, that's the most fundamental question, I think, to be asked, and it's very difficult to answer. I think the values are there already in principle. I mean, it's trust, truth, democracy, liberal democracy, and so on and so on, the rule of law, and yes, let right be done. But how to, well, reenact this idea and how to bring it back into public discourses. I mean, within liberal democracies, it is already difficult enough given the barrage of fake news. But what about all the other 2/3 of this planet where democracy is not the major form of rule? So this is problematic. And also to Mr. Pament, I mean, I like the idea of demoting certain undesired content, by way of twitching the algorithm. But then how realistic is that? Is that possible? Because all these algorithms that we're talking about, belong to companies like Facebook and the Google Alphabet company and so on. These are black boxes. We don't have really access to them. We barely understand them and how they work, how they function. But can we really tweak them? Can we really change them? I don't see it. Realistically speaking, I don't see it. So this is a huge problem for the future of global dialogue, etc., and also within nations.
Okay, Professor Pament?
I think of GDPR. Is everyone familiar with GDPR, the information privacy laws that the EU created a few years ago? And it's very complicated. I don't think anyone understands it, but it's become sort of a global standard because any US company where any of the data may end up passing through the EU has to comply with GDPR. And it makes me think that there is still, even in 2021, the opportunity for an institution with some influence like the EU to create a standard for its member states that could end up becoming a standard for democracies everywhere. Basically, something like a GDPR, but for handling disinformation or for handling foreign interference. And if that were the case, I think it would be more likely that the big digital platforms would put more resources into complying, because what they don't want, what they're really afraid of, is having to deal with 200 different markets and comply with different laws in each of those different markets and tailor their services to any greater degree. If there's one standard that the majority of democratic countries uses, they're more likely to commit to that, which then means that those principles would be more attractive to developing countries who are also updating their laws. What I mean to say by this is that if I can be optimistic, there is a pathway to creating a set of rules, a set of norms that could apply, that could solve some of these problems. It is very optimistic, but it's there. It has been done in other areas. It could happen.
Let us all be optimistic. Yes, I agree with you.
Okay. I think we don't have any other choice, do we? I think we need to be, staying optimistic in trying to find some alternative ways to solve this kind of mistrusted sphere of information. Okay, I think our time is up. Before we finish this session, let's check with the audience. Do you have any other question from the floor? The audience is out there. Please, share your questions with us. Okay, I think this is kind of far from the optimistic about the possibilities that we have, the question from the audience. Okay, I think it is time to wrap up the session. Thank you for your participation, and actually I learned very much from you guys today. So thank you, and have a good morning and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Che. What a thought-provoking session. I thought how great it would be if we could invite all moderators, presenters, discussants here to Korea and have a second round of in-depth discussion. So I pray for this opportunity next time. And that concludes our conference for today. I'm glad we have a very productive and interesting discussions today. And I hope our participants had a chance to learn more about the current trend of public diplomacy. Finally, on behalf of the Korean Association for Public Diplomacy, I would like to thank all presenters and all discussants for taking precious time out of your busy schedules. Once again, thank you for all participation today. Please stay safe. I ask for your continued support and interest in our association. 감사합니다.